I want to introduce the panel. The panel is just outstanding, and I want to thank them for all of their time and dedication to this over the last several weeks. We'll introduce Pete Ambrositis first. Pete, do you want to give a wave?
Thanks, Laurel. I'm glad to see my middle name's been left out this week. Thank you.
Yes, I won't wag my maternal finger at you. Pete Ambrositis, he's a senior client partner with Korn Ferry, and he's been in the business for 30 years of consulting on diversity strategies and things like that. So he comes from a long history and experience of being out there in the world, trying to create this kind of conversation and get people to make changes. I want to then also recognize Clennon L. King. He is a celebrated journalist, historian, and documentary. He's been out there in Albany, Georgia, where he's from, but he spent a lot of time in Boston as well, and has created Augustine Monica Films. And he has made some groundbreaking films about things that are less spoken about and out there in the world, and has been a voice for change on so many levels. We have all these bios, by the way, at mvyradio.org/diversity. You can read a little more depth. Sandra Pimentel, who has been on this island for a very long time, but she was born in Boston. She's a nurse. She's a writer. She just put out a book called, Sandy, help me out here. It's Blind Acceptance is the name of her book. Am I right?
Yes, you are, Laurel.
Yeah. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And she and her husband have worked and raised their children on Martha's Vineyard. And she's done a lot of work in the social equity environment and is co-founder of the Martha's Vineyard Diversity Coalition. So thank you for being here, Sandy. We have young and vibrant Tiffany Adams. She's 25 years old, and she is a powerhouse out there in Quincy, Mass. She's from DC originally, and she's just making her mark with her incredible articulation of the anti-racist movement. She is out there igniting her community in Quincy to get people to, and that's a tough neighborhood to be doing it in, and Tiffany will tell you. So she is out there also teaching anti-racist training for the nonprofit called Calling All Crows. So thank you, Tiffany, for being here. You're remarkable. Michael, oh, say that again. Okay. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Always, you're a gift. And Michael McCullough, who is another one. He's got a book out right now. It's called No Truth Left to Tell. It's an extraordinary book that takes you into the layers. It's historical fiction, but it's based on a lot of things that he experienced. He's been in law practice for 30 years. He served as a supervisory assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of Florida and a federal civil rights prosecutor at the Department of Justice in DC. He is quite an extraordinary guy who is out there always fighting for justice on every human level. And I urge you to read the book too, No Truth Left to Tell. It is one of those books that will take you through a lot of layers of your own experience in life. And so thank you so much, Michael, for being here and giving us your time. If Michael wants to.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
I'm thrilled to be a part of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Michael. And without further ado, my partner here, who has helped really create these from the beginning, it started with talks with Dr. Walter Collier, who has got such a rich history in public health, really, public counseling. He's a retired social scientist, strategic planner. He has a master's in social psychology from Brooklyn College. He earned a doctorate in public policy analysis from New York University. He has worked as a consultant in so many governmental agencies, and he has written a book called Why Racism Persists, An Uncomfortable Truth, which is the foundation of what conversation we're going to have here tonight. He is also one of the founders and trustees of the Martha's Vineyard Diversity Coalition, an organization dedicated to eradicating racism. So all of our voices tonight will, on the other side of this hour, be able to be more well-equipped to go out there and do just that. So Walter, Dr. Collier, I would love for you to introduce our topic tonight of, give us a little background on systemic racism and what exactly that is.
Okay.
thank you again for involving me in this journey, which I hope will lead to fruitful ground. But systemic racism is one of those terms that is kind of bandied around a lot, and I'm not so sure that a lot of people even understand what it means. So I will take a stab at providing at least a broad framework in which we can continue our discussion this evening. Systemic racism is synonymous really with institutional racism and structural racism. They don't really differ in terms of the elements of the definition, but it is an interrelated system of areas that are designed or have evolved to have an individual or collective impact in denying Black people access to opportunities in employment, education, housing, finance, you name it. And there is some kind of law or legislation or practice that is activated to keep Blacks from advancing in those particular areas. It's embedded in our society so much that it may be invisible, let's say, to whites, but certainly its impact and its effects are very much obvious to the targets of the system. The areas, the sectors that are interrelated are education, employment, finance, voting, healthcare, marriage, family, and on and on and on. It encompasses almost every aspect of an individual's life. Its roots stem back to the days of plantation slavery, where the slave owner, the plantation owner, his aim or her aim was to control the slave completely, his or her entire life. And as a result of that aim, the slave had no freedom to do anything without permission or without some kind of access granted by the slave owner. That system has been carried through the generations, and it still exists. The effect of systemic racism does not allow a typical African American to be born, to grow up, and to pursue his or her life without limitations, without obstacles, without distractions, without interference of this thing called systemic racism. What is it? It is a collection of policies and practices that are aimed at controlling the people who are at the bottom of this caste system. And those people at the bottom happen to be people of color. Why is it? Well, in order for the powers to be to maintain their goals, which essentially has to do with money and financial wealth, there has to be doesn't have to be, but they have decided that a system is needed to keep certain people in place, to keep a certain order of things, a social order as to who advances and who does not advance. It's really very, very virulent. It can destroy lives, it has destroyed lives, and it has destroyed families. To give you a simple example, a large number of African Americans are in the lower classes, the poor classes, and so they live in poor neighborhoods. Poor neighborhoods typically have poor schools, schools that are under-resourced, so they don't have the same kind of books and same kind of technologies and other kinds of things that help to teach, that help a student to learn. As a result, the students don't do well. They don't do as well as they could. So for example, the dropout rates among African American students is very high compared to whites, compared to Asians and other groups. As a result of that, the employment possibilities are limited because of limited education and training. Because employment possibilities are limited, then wages are limited. If wages are limited, then the Blacks are unable to buy their own homes. So housing becomes a problem. If wages are limited, healthcare is limited because you do have to pay for quality care, despite this democratic narrative that goes around that everybody has access to good health care. That's not true. So when you look at those things, they all are interrelated and tied, and therefore they make a system. And the system is embedded in our society. And it just stops an individual from achieving what he or she can. Does it totally work? Does it totally stop African Americans from achieving? No, it does not. Over time, African Americans, through their own strength and determination, have found ways to navigate the system, have found ways to jump over obstacles and to do better. But having said that, the majority of African Americans are victims of the systemic racism. And that's why when the comparisons are made between how well whites are doing compared to blacks, or how blacks are doing compared to Hispanics, blacks usually rate in the lower statistics of healthcare, of employment, and and on and on and on and on. When we look at the system, it seems overwhelming. It seems that it cannot be managed, it cannot be overcome, it cannot be eliminated, but it can. Because the one thing that keeps the system going, that oils the system, is white complicity. As long as whites do not stand up against the system, as long as they continue to go about their business and not really thinking about their fellow citizens of a darker hue, then the system will continue. What keeps whites complicit? White privilege. If we look back in history, for example, again, during the time of slavery, there was a point where certain European groups who had come over as servants, indentured servants, began to talk with the slaves on the plantations. The Irish, for example, they came over, they started talking. When the slave owners observed what was going on and realized that these two groups were comparing notes and commiserating, and maybe even daring to talk about some kind of rebellion, white privilege was born. It was an incentive, and the incentive went something like this. If you do not aid or help Black people or help the slave, we will reward you with some kind of privilege. And hence the incentive has been built in and institutionalized in the system of racism. Again, we see that during the early 20th century, when Eastern Europeans and Italians and others were coming to America. And one of the things that they learned rather quickly, I don't know whether they were actual formal lessons taught at Ellis Island, but what they did learn was to stay away from Black people, treat them as some kind of less than human species, realize that they are less than you and they are lower than you and you are better than them because you are white. Forget about the fact that you're Irish and Italian and Danish. That doesn't matter. You're white, and we want to make sure that you keep that distinction in your mind. And what was the incentive? What was the bribe? White privilege. We will help you with your immigration. We will help you with your housing. We will help you with your employment. And another example of that, World War II. Blacks were, in the foxholes fighting and putting their lives on the line and doing the best they can to help their fellow soldiers. But when the soldiers came back to America and America decided to give them VA loans and loans for education, guess who wasn't eligible? Blacks. So did we hear any white soldiers stand up or march to Washington and say, how could you treat my fellow soldiers, my brothers in arms, the way you are treating them, not allowing them to gain the same kind of privileges that I have? Not a word. Silence. So again, there are many examples of white intentional or unintentional complicity, and that's the glue that keeps the system going. When whites say, for example, in some of the feedback we've gotten, well, what can I do? Well, one of the things that whites can do is to stand up against laws, legislation, practices that deliberately deny access of opportunities to people of color.
Yeah, that's
Sitting-
right, Walter.
Sitting by and doing nothing does not help. So that's kind of a broad overview of what systemic racism is all about. But the main thing is that it's embedded. So for us to do something about it, we have to embed it. And that takes realization, commitment, and really maybe a risk taking from the point of view of some whites. For example, when I gave a talk on my book a couple of years ago at the Chilmark Library, there was a white woman after I had finished talking about systemic racism who stood up and said, "I am not going to give up my white privilege." And she went on to say, because it has helped me and has helped my children, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that brings up this idea of selfishness. Are we just for ourselves, or are we for one another? Are we just for our groups, or are we for this country? And that's something that needs to be confronted. And I will stop here. I won't go into it because I'm sure that my fellow panelists and the people who are listening in have input and have things to say about this. So
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you so much, Walter. That was a very important lesson for us to hear, and a historical perspective. And once again, I want to bring up his book that he wrote, Why Racism Persists. And all the books we're mentioning here tonight, we will have links on our webpage at mbyradio.org/diversity underneath each panelist's bio. If they have a book, we'll give you a link to where you can purchase that book. We've seen some comments come through about that, so I want to make sure you know about that. I also want to draw attention to the fact that, as you listen to Walter talk, we know how insidious this is, and just how what we have to do most of all is move past our white fragility and guilt, and be able to understand that that's not doing anything going forward. What we need to do is actually clear all that away and start with this idea that, okay, we're here, we're ready to get our hands dirty, we're ready to learn how to make this change that Walter was talking about. So going forward, I want to address those kinds of things that panelists have been talking about and what Walter was just talking about. I want to thank AHA New Bedford for helping support this panel series. We have 2 more weeks after this, and we are going to continue the conversation, which is being directed by participants like you who are interested in learning more. So following up on what Walter just brought up, I would like to ask the panelists if there are any follow-up additions that you would like to add from your perspective and experience of examples of systemic racism, because it is such a thing that we don't know. We just wake up in this world and we don't necessarily know how to decode everything around us. And so we need that education and awareness to be brought before us. So I ask anybody to just give a thumbs up or a wave if you'd like to.
Can I
Lennon?
say? Yeah. And this is with all due respect to Dr. Collier. Is this whole notion, I was listening to him and I recognize he's a Black man like myself, but there is something very pejorative about a term he kept using over and over again that we in American society use over and over again, which is a code word for Black people. And that is the word slave. The slaves and the slaves and the slave owners. The reality is it's a code word for Black people. And yet at the same time, it's not who we are. It's what was done to us. And so oftentimes, especially in this here and now, we prefer to be called enslaved. It's what was done to us, not who we are. And so in many respects, people take vigorous exception to being referred to as slaves or their forebears being referred to as slaves. They were enslaved. We are enslaved Africans rather than slaves. Or our people were enslaved rather than being slaves. That's not who we are. That's what was done to us. And so I just want to make that nomenclature, that distinction in terms of nomenclature, that it tends to be very offensive to people, oftentimes Black people, because of the fact that's not who we are. It's what was done to us. So I'll just leave that with you, Laurel.
I find that I find that also very constructive in that it's an illustration that all of us, no matter what color our skin is, we can expand upon what another person of our skin color has to say, because even growing up in the same household, our brothers and sisters may not, we grew up in the same environment, but we decode things very differently. So I think that's part of another thing to bring up to make us all feel comfortable that we can see things from different viewpoints and learn things from other people based on words like that. I mean, that's something I would have never thought of before. So Clennon, thank you for bringing that up. But I think that all of these things that we're learning tonight they're incredibly important for us to keep our minds open and also understand that we're all coming from different generations and different backgrounds and different everything. So that when we are moving forward in these conversations, that everything that is being added to illuminate and move us forward. So I think that just played out very, very nicely. I thank you for both of you for that, because I think it's important to recognize what has been understood and what is now changing out there in the world. So thank you so much for that. That was really both of you, Walter and Clennon, for starting that foundation for the night. That was wonderful. I am so grateful to these panelists, because what we're going to talk about tonight is expanding on that, because this is an uncomfortable conversation, as we keep saying. But when we learn these things, like implicit bias is something that came through last week in a few of the comments toward the end that people wanted to know more about. And I think that plays in nicely with systemic racism, because I think that implicit bias is exactly what keeps us kind of in this cage of not being aware, of being ignorant to what is beyond that implicit bias. Does somebody want to take up, Sandy, want to take up implicit bias?
Yeah, I thank you, Glennon, for that, and Walter. I think it just shows that we're learning every day. We're learning every day, and I learned something tonight. I really appreciate that. Lauren, you were asking for some examples, and I think when I think about systemic racism, I think about the fact that systemic racism is really associated with individuals. There's groups of individuals who sort of lead to a system that oppresses people. And I thought when you asked, when we define systemic racism, I thought it might be helpful to give some examples of how implicit bias and privilege, how it all works. And I found that Black newborns, African-American newborns, are likely to survive when they're looked after by an African-American physician. And in fact, African-American babies are 3 times more likely to die with a white physician than a Black physician. And this was a research. There were 1.8 million births that was studied, and I think that the mortality shrunk by 39% to 58% when these children had physicians that looked like them. Now, I'm not saying that all of the white physicians were racist, but there's something going on here that is systemic, that is leading to these deaths of these children. And I think that when we look at what we can do to address this, it all comes down to individual awareness, that these physicians have been indoctrinated in some ways in the same way I have. And we have a long journey of indoctrination that we have to sort of reflect on. And I guess what I'm saying is the answer is in the self-awareness of individuals within that system. The other thing is that there are food deserts where people, another example, where people can't get fresh vegetables, and pharmacies that actually They know where people can pay and when they can't. And they know where the illnesses are. And they actually are in those neighborhoods. And neighborhoods where people don't have the resources, they don't have the pharmacies. So there's just a couple of examples of systemic racism. But what it all comes down to is us being aware that it's happening, and to look inside ourselves, and to also look to the system and see how we can influence it.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you very much. Michael, did you have something you wanted to say about this? I would love to get your input on this.
Well, when we were talking about systemic racism, I was trying to visualize, have either a metaphor or something visual to capture the concept of it. And I think historically, with in the history of our country, in terms of legal discrimination and segregation and unequalness, I equate it to the wall. Is that a black person can be staring at a thick, high wall and trying to figure out how to advance themselves or a family member or a community. And that's the early and maybe most of the history of the United States has been with the wall erected and very high and thick. And then when we make progress on terms of the legal fronts and dismantling with the passage of the 14th, 15th Amendments, 13th Amendment, 14th and 15th Amendments, Civil Rights Acts, we start dismantling the wall itself. But what replaces it is a headwind, and it's invisible, but it still has force and effect. But it's harder to get your head around because it's not as easy to see. You can, one can argue, and I think successfully, that you can see the results of it, but attaching the causation to the headwind, the selective headwind against people of color, Blacks, and other groups, minority groups in the United States, but I think our conversation is focused on race and African Americans and Black individuals, citizens and otherwise, and what headwinds they face currently in the United States. So I just wanted to offer that as sort of a visual way to conceptualize systemic racism, that it's a little different how we look at it, but at its core, it is still this headwind in terms of realizing opportunity and equity and fairness.
Thank you, Michael. And that really makes it harder to, like, as you said, it makes it harder to see and harder to anticipate. So Peter.
So I love that, Michael, you used the terminology headwinds, because quite often when we're working with client organizations regarding their talent systems and structures that are in place, does the top half of the house look like the bottom half of the house, or is it much more weighted towards people that look like me in the top half, for example? And it could be true for race or gender. And so oftentimes what we're doing is evaluating those systems and making recommendations about how to improve current state, knowing that we have a long way to go. Unfortunately, what I run into occasionally is that people that look like me will take offense to the fact that what we're trying to do is purposely do something, make an effort with people of color or females, whatever that underrepresented talent might look like, to give them a better chance of advancing within the organization. And oftentimes someone will say, so then you're telling me that I need to lower my standards for a certain position or a certain role. And that is not what we're saying. What we're saying is that we need to be able to look at opportunities as they arise, and what is the reason why we don't have a slate of candidates that's more diverse, for example, for promotion? Is there a systemic reason? And if there is, what can we do to counteract that headwind and create some tailwinds, to use your analogy, Michael? So it's work that's fascinating and ongoing. Unfortunately, we've been doing it as a society for a long time, and we're not making enough advancement. So again, this is one of those situations that we can talk about the macro, but we really need to start acting local, right? You need to look at your organization, your teams, your clubs, and asking the question, Why do we look the way we look? And is that intentional or unintentional?
Thank you, Peter. That's a big question all of us are having to take a look around at right now. Tiffany, I wanted to ask you, because you're this new generation out there who's, starting some really amazing little controlled burns out there that we all need to just get rid of all this debris that isn't working for us anymore and bring forth some new growth. And in your town right now, what have you witnessed and what have you been part of when you get out there and you see the systemic racism, you see implicit bias, how you respond to that? And how can we respond to that?
This is hard because I know in Quincy right now, things are just really difficult. Whereas like there has been no real movement when it comes to dismantling structural inequalities, systemic racism, sorry. But there hasn't been that movement like there should be that movement. And I often talk to my friends because I'm a huge believer that if you really want to change systemic racism, you need to go talk to the people at the bottom of the pyramid. And I think that sometimes what is not happening enough is we're not going to go talk to Black people. We're not talking. Like, we're making these decisions and we're not even going to the people that are the ones who are being oppressed by the system, the ones who are being affected by the system the most. And I see that in Quincy all the time. And I see that in the government around the world, like around all of this nation. And I'm always like, have you guys even been mentored by a Black person? Have you been to a Black community? Like, do you actually know the struggles of Black people? And I believe that like, until you really start to go to the bottom of that pyramid and you actually start having real conversations where you're not utilizing white saviorism, right? Where you're not just like, oh, I'm going to be the white person that comes and save the Black people, but you're really going to these communities and trying to understand like what is really happening, is only when we're going to be able to really dismantle systemic racism.
So what you're saying is there's a lot, let's not pay any more lip service, or let's not do any more window dressing. Let's really get down underneath to where we need to kind of, to use an analogy of I can't really do what Michael and Peter did and use those wonderful, tailwinds and headwinds, but I feel like there needs to be this kind of it's like a tear down. It's a tear down. Where it's not a renovation anymore, it's a tear down. And you need to start with recognizing and getting everybody involved again from the ground up.
And everybody needs to put in this work. It's not just white people who need to put in this work. It's Black people who need to put in this work. We all need to be putting in this work to dismantle even the defensiveness in our own selves. Because the reality is, and I think I said this last time, Black people can allow white supremacy to run rampant because that's what we've been taught for so long. So we have to dismantle that within ourselves. And white people, you guys just have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Like, there's no real way to say that any better. What can you do when someone has a wall? Be comfortable being uncomfortable and talking with that person. It's not me as a Black person's job to go and try to dismantle that wall. I'll do it because it's my life that's at stake. But I actually need my white accomplices and my white allies to go and try to dismantle that wall. Because until that happens, like, we're going to continue to deal with the same thing over and over again. And it's not okay to ask Black people to do that. Like, we go through enough. We're trying to keep our joy. And it's not okay that we have to be the ones to go to white people who have millions of walls up and still do not understand why we're upset when we're dying at extreme rates. Like, it's not okay. We can't even get like good health insurance. It's not okay. And so I believe that like, if you really want to know what you can do as a white person, like, go talk to other white people, like accomplices. Where are you? Show up, step up. That's what you can do.
Tiffany, thank you for that. That's a rally cry. And that's something that we all, I think every human being, as you say, no matter if we're Black or white or no matter where we come from, to just try and get past this defensive layer, which is so hard to do. I mean, can anybody give some on the panel want to speak to ways that we can help ourselves drop our defenses? maybe some language that we can use when we're in a situation, because I've gotten many comments, and I just want to bring one up right now, from people who have had conversations with people in the past. All of them are very similar, but here's one that comes from, I have a friend who grew up in northern Vermont who has a lot of different beliefs from me, but I try to have a dialogue. And he said to me the other day, why is this thing about racism in my face all the time these days? He went on to say that it's just never been a problem for me before. And I said, well, that's because you're white. He was just plainly and openly surprised by that, said he never thought about it like that and wanted to talk more. And somebody else said, I want to hear about actions to take to intervene when hearing someone making a racist comment or decision. I'd love to learn how to best go back to him to restart a conversation. And he's talking about a conversation he had with somebody on one of the local fire officials, where he said, oh, it's just some bad apples. And he was stunned by that remark because of the fact that he sees people kind of being blasé about it and brushing past it. And he wants to know, how can you start a conversation in a we-they polarization that seems like a dead end when speaking with anyone who denies that this is something that we need to pay attention to. So I threw a lot out at you, to the panel, but the bottom line is that how can we go out there and get past our own insecurities and use language? Can you give us some language to use when we are faced with these kinds of significant interactions?
Laurel, can you hear
Yes.
me?
Yes, Glennon, thank you.
One of the things that I really took advantage of during the near 10 years that I was living in Boston and in New England was that you guys are actually close to the home of the largest enslaver of Africans in the entire country. I'm talking about less than an hour from Woods Hole. You can drive to the home of the largest enslaver of Africans in the history of the country, and that is the Wolves. And the name of the town is Bristol, Rhode Island. And I think that part of it is to kind of understand that when we're sitting there and going ooh and ahhing at somebody storming Washington, D.C. and the Capitol, or we're looking, awry at what's going on in Charlottesville, that this stuff is actually very close to the history of the very place that, many of us call home. In this case, it's very close to Martha's Vineyard. And so I do think it's really, really important that you talk about what people can do. Yeah, part of it is educating. And one of the things that I found that was very enlightening to me when I went to Bristol is that I'd always been told that, yes, the world has been colonized by white people, courtesy of the Bible and the gun. And what's so telling about going to Bristol, Rhode Island, is that when you go to the family graveyard of the Wolves, who they married into was a huge, huge other white family who had made their fortune on guns that as Colt, C-O-L-T, as in Colt 45. And so I just think that there's value, again, we talk about educating ourselves in visiting places like there's a wonderful wharf where they actually took in enslaved Africans that's still standing in Bristol, where you can have lunch, you can have all of that. But I'll guarantee you that most people don't even know that this place exists, and it's within earshot of Martha's Vineyard. And so I encourage people to get out there and understand. And there's artifacts and all of that around slavery that's right there. So I encourage people to do that. So
Thank you, Glennon. Sandy.
Yeah, I would respond also that we have an African-American freedom trail on the island that many people don't know about. And, I just want to point that out. And Laurel, you were referring to people that are really difficult to reach. And I think you talked about Kyle Williams. And I think we have to sort of figure out what we can do and what we can't. And I think if we're going to get the biggest change to our society, we have to mobilize those people who really have a heart and want to be changed.
So
And-
maybe Sandy introduced me to Kyle Williams, and one of the things that we had said before tonight started, which I should share, and it's Kyle Williams is from a long talk. If you can look him up, and he has been out there giving these long talks. And one of the things he was saying was he doesn't want to waste time with people who have that wall up that you can't really talk to. He wants to, because there's so many other people willing to listen and educate ourselves and learn the history and move forward, that's what we have to do. So I hear everybody saying on the panel is that we just need to continue educating ourselves, and we need to continue just having the conversations and moving forward. Now, I've seen several comments come through that I want to bring up. Somebody, and I don't know if you mind using your name, but I won't until you tell me I can. But wanted to hear some examples of specific public policies or laws that she should be opposing, to address. Okay, Michael, yes.
I think in my area of experience, the criminal justice system, I have had a complete evolution and change of thought in terms of the bail and the bond system in the United States justice system. I have come to believe that it is based on a false premise, and that it is disproportionately impacting folks who can't afford, for example, a cash bond. It keeps people in jail for the most modest of accusations of crimes that it's such a disconnect between the idea of protecting the community from somebody who's just been accused, not convicted of any wrongdoing. And so I think one specific area of reform in the criminal justice system that has gotten traction, and it's a realistic objective to change across the country, both at the federal level, but more importantly, in the local jurisdictions, is reform of the bond and the bail system. I think that's a very particular and significant issue that public support for change would result in progress.
Thank you, Michael. Anybody else have any advice when it comes to the laws or things that we can do on that level?
Yeah,
Walter?
there are. I guess if we all really had more time, we could think of a lot, because there are a lot of things that people could stand up for or stand up against. One of the things that local people could stand up against is this voter suppression movement that is going around this country from state to state. And it would appear that other than Blacks, other than Black organization, no one really stands up against these proposed laws. No one goes to the sessions where the laws are being voted on to make their opposition known. And white people can do that. They can do that. They can oppose these laws. They can make their voices heard. But that doesn't happen. But that is something concrete that certainly can be done. There are Sandy was talking about the disparity in healthcare. There are practices, written practices, let's say in the city of New York, that promote this statistic. Black women are 8 times more likely to die in childbirth in New York City hospitals than white women. There's a practice. There are policies. Some of them are written, some of them are not, but nobody stands up against these. You know, these reports that Sandy mentioned, they come out and everybody's saying, oh, oh my God, that's so terrible, but no one does anything about it. I mean, Tiffany hit on one thing. You know, you need to go into Black communities, you need to speak to people. But another thing, an action thing that can be undertaken right at your kitchen table or in your bedroom, is self-introspection. Where are you? Where's your bias? What can you do about it? What have you taught your kids? What have you discussed with your grandparents or Uncle Joe, who seems to be a redneck racist? there are individual things that can be done, as well as standing up against poor and discriminatory policies. You know, and again, if we had more time, all of us could come up with a whole bunch of them.
Well, maybe what we can do is we can have the panelists kind of come together with some examples, and we'll post those on our diversity page, maybe some links that we can pad people with to get more information about these kinds of things in the future. Peter, I did want to ask you too, just from a business standpoint, you know, you work with people all the time within the corporate world when it comes to diversity strategies and things like that. So just coming through your lens from a business side of things, people who are running businesses, people who are, and I think this goes into schools as well. Somebody made a comment that, you know, we need to help to get African Americans and Blacks back in the classroom and administrative staff in schools, pre-graduate school as teachers and administrators. This is what we can do to help. And so things like this, I mean, how can we start to, if we're a business owner, if we're a principal of school or a superintendent, how can we start to move towards changing these strategies?
Well, I think, again, and I can't remember which of my esteemed panelists mentioned it, I think it was you, Tiffany, we actually need to be talking to the people about how they're feeling about how they're being treated, right? It can be great to be assuming that, you know, people that look like me are going to fix this situation when we don't even know what good looks like. One of the things we want to be able to say to, and board of directors and investors are requiring more diverse boards. They're requiring more diverse leadership review pipeline. They're requiring that people take a look at what are the systems that you have in place in these global multi-billion-dollar organizations. What are you really going to do? Because the data would say that we haven't done enough lately, right? We haven't gained enough. There's only 19 Black CEOs in Fortune 500 companies today in 2021. That's ridiculous. And the fact is, why is that? What are the things that have happened over history that are causing that to be? And what are we going to do about it if we want change? We can say we're going to mandate more diverse slates, but that doesn't mean that we have people that are prepared to take on that role and be successful. So I think to become a change agent means addressing this whole race thing on a daily basis whenever you see it. And sometimes it's hard because it takes a lot of energy to not be that avoider or perpetuator by not doing anything when you hear that negative comment coming from an individual who may be a family member, maybe a friend, or maybe just someone that you hear on the street.
So the reactions are going to be different across the board, but we all have to basically search ourselves and come from a true self perspective and understanding ourselves first, and then going out and being proud and being brave to be ourselves to use again, we keep going back to you, Tiffany, but but to use that, to be brave and not safe. I think the time to be safe, I would like to get feedback on the panel. The time to be safe is over. It's time to be brave. And yes, Tiffany.
Yeah, I think when Black bodies are literally dying at the hands of people who are supposed to protect them, I think it's been time for us to stop being safe. Like it's long overdue. Like we literally really need people to like stand up for something. Like my mother used to tell me, if you don't stand up for something, you'll fall for anything. I don't want to fall for anything and everything. I want to stand up for what I believe in. And I believe that Black people are like amazing, because we are, just so you know. So I just think that like, you're looking for something to stand up for us. Like we are worthy for people to stand up for. And I think that you, like white people, you need to remember that. And Black people, if no one has ever told you that you're worthy to be stood up for, you are. I believe that, and you should believe that. And I just think that like we just have to do better. Like over in my head, I'm just thinking we have to do better. We can no longer be complacent in the fight to equity. Like we are dying in these streets. I don't think people understand, like we've been dying for a very long time, and it's constantly happening over and over and over again. So the time is now. You're looking for a time. If you are out there looking for someone to say, hey, the time is now, I'm letting you know it's been time, but go do something now. The time is now.
Thank you, Tiffany. Wait, wow. See, this is the thing. We need to, I've been watching the chat, and I have to say, everybody, thank you so much to the participants, to you for adding in all of your resources and all of your, and we're going to add those to our diversity page. There's a lot of good resources out there for us to start continuing to dive deep into our need for education. And Michael, you also put some things up there as well. I don't know if there was anything you put up there that you want to elaborate on, but I would love to have you do that.
No, I was just posting some follow-up of, I think, Walter's comments. I think voting is one of those pillars. It's a foundational issue. And if you don't have expanded access, if you don't have open, safe access to expressing your choices to your elected officials, nothing else is going to work in a democracy. So, so I was just adding some just examples of anti-suppression initiatives, and I think it's becoming a ripe issue after record turnout in this last election cycle. One of the unfortunate reactions appears to be that that there's a new effort to try to create barriers. You know, not headwinds. I think walls. I think rebuilding walls to access to voting, and that would be a shame upon us all if we allowed that to happen.
Michael, I just actually had a comment come through, a question for you come through, and Sandy, I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Michael, this question is posed to you. If you could give thoughts on felony disenfranchisement.
Yes, you know, I'm a former federal prosecutor, both a civil rights prosecutor, but also just an assistant U.S. attorney, and then I was the elected state attorney in a community of 1.4 million people. So I have had views, and those views have changed over time. Interestingly, I originally, years ago, 30 some years ago, when I started off as a young lawyer, had a notion that, gee, if it's part of the punishment for a crime, then that's one of the unfortunate consequences of doing the deed. You know, oversimplifying my thinking about it. But I have now come to see how unfair and unproductive and upside down that thought can be. We want people who have served, you know, setting aside issues of other kinds of inequities, and, you know, just assuming that someone is being punished for criminal activity. When they serve their sentences and come back into the community, re-entry is one of the, it's in their interest, the person returning to the community, and it's in our interest as a community to help those people, and not just re-enter, but to succeed. And one of those issues is to get them to have folks be invested in the body politic. So I think here in Florida, where I am now, they passed a constitutional amendment to change Florida, which is one of the minority states that had permanent disenfranchisement of convicted felons, unless you went to the clemency board to change the system. But that's also been another struggle beyond the scope of the question. But my view has changed, and I am a big proponent of restoration of civil rights for folks who have served their sentences.
Thank you, Michael. Sandy.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to the issue of voting. And I think the one thing that we were able to do this time is to mobilize. And I think the question about what can we do, I think the biggest threat to voting right now is gerrymandering. I think that there are efforts across the country that are going on. Eric Holder, I think, had a program. And if people are successful in gerrymandering, it really will unravel everything that's been done. And it will, there's still a lot more work to be done with that. So an answer to the question, what can I do? What laws? Look at what's going on with gerrymandering across the country, because it will make a huge difference in the results.
Thank you, Sandy. we're coming to an end. An hour goes by fast, and I want to, just kind of pull in some threads that we can walk away with, and that is getting, I think, education came back into tonight's conversation. Is we just need to continue to educate ourselves tonight. We need to look at places in our towns, in our municipalities, in our school systems, in our businesses, where we really need to see more diversity. I want to just thank Ambrose. I'm naming you, but there's been comments coming through in the chat that have really been driving home this need for seeing more faces in our educational institutions, because we talked last week about our history books telling one story, and we need to expand our collective history and just learn a little bit more about each other and our cultures and what has happened, and move forward without this insecurity or self-doubt or fragility, to move forward with each other, knowing that, yes, this happened and it's uncomfortable and it's horrible, but we need to move forward together to really start to build a house we all want to live in, and to treat a person next to us with the respect and the dignity that every human being has a right to. So we are going to be posting a lot of the links from our panelists and from other members of the participants in tonight's conversation on our diversity page. There's so many links coming through. It seems like we can really start to reimagine the system if we all just do our part, with going and looking at all of these policies that we can take and contacting all of our local authorities, and then moving out from there. I do want to, before we close off, ask any of the panelists if there was any lingering thoughts that you wanted to share before we signed off, quick comments or anything like that. Glennon?
I have one. I feel like in some respects, just in terms of reflecting on tonight's discussion, there is something that Toni Morrison called the white gaze. And largely it's about, basically, it's very much, so much of the feedback to me sounds as though it's directed at white people. And that's all fine and well. But as Tiffany talked about, the people on the receiving end oftentimes are Blacks, and especially Black males. And so I reflect upon my own childhood, and I reflect as my father was about to send me away to New England boarding schools. And he says, look, it doesn't matter whether you end up at Harvard or Yale or at Oxford, you've got to carry a mirror. And this is in large part my message to Black males more than anything, because I hope they're listening as well. And I hope the parents of them are listening as well. You've got to carry in your back pocket an imaginary mirror to always remind you who you are. Always remind you, because the moment you forget is the moment you're really in trouble. And so while we talk about a very pluralistic sort of America, Black boys can't afford to even navigate this world thinking that somehow it's all that, because it isn't. It's like a blind person trying to cross an interstate and saying, I'm not blind. It's just dangerous business. It's a dangerous proposition. And so what I would encourage Black parents, and especially Black males, to do is always remind themselves that they are Black males in an otherwise white system. So that's what I'll leave you with.
Thank you, Glennon. Those are amazing words to close the night out on. And may all of us go away from tonight with that sense of self and that self-acknowledgement, so we can empower the person next to us to pull out who they really are and not forget who they are. We all have different experiences, and we all have to help each other through. So thank you for tuning in. Don't go anywhere yet, because we have a very special video we're going to show in just a second. Thanks to Tiffany. We want to leave on a joyful note, and knowing that all of what we discuss can be hard at times, but we are still in the middle of this discussion. And I really hope that you'll attend the next 2 weeks, 5 o'clock next week and the last Monday in February. My name is Laurel Reddington, and on behalf of everybody at MVY Radio, a listener-supported nonprofit radio station, thank you for tuning in tonight. Thank you to AHA New Bedford for underwriting support. Thank you to our panelists, who are just so much a part of my heart. I've learned so much from each of you. Dr. Walter Collier, thank you so much. And Sandy Pimentel, Glennon King, Tiffany Adams, Michael McCullough, Peter Ambrositis. Thank you so much for your wisdom and input. And thank you to all the participants who have also contributed to the chat tonight, and I hope to see you next week. So it is time for our joyful moment, and thank you very much.
The second time this week, a black man is shot by a police officer.
I woke up and I felt much heavier than I usually do.
Sandra Bland arrested, then found dead in her jail cell 3 days later.
Can I acknowledge that actually things are not great right now? I felt like the opposite of joy. Something told me that I had to post this image, make a call about Black joy. I posted that with the statement that said, let us bombard the internet with joy. That joy is a form of resistance.
Black joy to me means being able to say I love and see my people every time we are in one another's presence.
The Black Joy Project was birthed from that pain. Being real about the impact of consciously resisting to things, of just existing as a Black person in the world.
Owning that my spirit is one that comes from kings and queens long before me, and every day doing the work to intentionally reclaim my throne.
How do I heal in community? And that Black joy is very much a healing process. How do I build community and share more of like this Black joy magic?
Freedom through self-acceptance. We can only embrace and enjoy each other when we deprogram our self-hatred.
It's a space of reprieve. If any Black person, anywhere, wherever they are in the world, if they're not feeling good, that they know that there's a space where they can see the people that look like them smiling in real ways, and that they get to be a part of that community if they want to.
Me too.
Thank you so much, everybody. I hope that you take that with you and fill your heart up with it. And we can meet back here next week at 5 o'clock and continue our conversation so we can do better. Our Let's Do Better Racial Equity Conversation series. Thanks again and have a safe night.
Night.
Everybody, thank you.